Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Margarita. Hello, everybody. It's morning on the west coast of the United States, but I know you're joining from all different time zones, so thank you. Does it look good? Are we good to go? Okay. So, if I can advance my slides. Yeah, why am I here speaking to you today about sea otters, their conservation, and the green status assessment of species? How did I get here? Well, I grew up in California in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I went to my undergraduate school there, UC Berkeley, and studied general biology. I thought I was going to be a veterinarian, so I studied pre-vet. And then I applied for vet school, got in, but then I decided I wanted to work with healthy animals rather than sick animals all the time. So I pivoted and got my master's degree in California studying big cats. After that, I moved to Seattle and I started volunteering at the local zoo. And I was still working as a veterinary technician because that was my expertise. And then the Seattle Aquarium was looking for a animal health and research coordinator, and I had animal health experience working as a vet tech for 10 years, and I also had research experience. So they wanted somebody who could talk to the veterinarians and the keepers, as well as start a research program. So in 1995, I got my job at the Seattle Aquarium, and like I said, they wanted me to start a research program. So I looked around for the big cats, didn't find any at the aquarium, but I found the sea otters. And to me, they're like marine cats. So I said, well, this is going to be my first research project. So I started studying the sea otters, and then I decided that I needed more schooling to be able to lead and start a new research program. So I got my PhD at the University of Washington, and my dissertation was on sea otter genetics and endocrinology. Fast forward 30 years later, now I'm the Senior Conservation Research Manager. I oversee more than 10 long-term research projects from otters to sharks to kelp recovery, and I have five staff members that report to me. So a little bit about the Seattle Aquarium. Here is the aquarium on it's right downtown Seattle, right on the waterfront. You can see we've got our big wheel. It seems like every city has one of those these days. We've got the sports stadiums, and there's Mount Rainier in the distance. So it is downtown Seattle, but it's at a beautiful location right on the water. We mostly exhibit local temperate or cold water species of fish and invertebrates, seabirds, and marine mammals, but we did recently open a new building that is all tropical animals from the Indo-Pacific called the Ocean Pavilion. Many of our exhibits are mixed species exhibits. You can see here one of our favorite animals for people to come visit is the giant Pacific octopus, which is really fun for the kids. And then this is our underwater dome, which is another one of those mixed species habitats that has sharks and salmon and rockfish, etc., and kelp. And of course, we have marine mammals. We have harbor seals, northern fur seals, and the sea otters. And I'd say the sea otters are probably the most iconic species that calls the Seattle Aquarium home. So a little bit about the two otter species in North America. There are two. There are the sea otters and the river otters, and both of them occur in Washington state. And so a lot of people will tell me, oh, yes, I have a sea otter living on my boat. And I think, well, probably not. And the reason is that sea otters and river otters are different. Sea otters are 3 to 4 times bigger than the North American river otter. So sea otters in Washington, on average, the females are about 70 pounds and the males are 90 to 100 pounds. So these are big animals. And our North American river otters that call Washington home are about 25 to 30 pounds. And the reason why people, when they see an otter in saltwater, they always want to call it a sea otter, but it's probably actually really a river otter because in the inland waterways of Puget Sound, there are very few sea otters, maybe one or two. Most of the sea otters in Washington are on our outer coast, and we have several marine foraging river otters. So, another difference between sea otters and river otters are that sea otters are true marine mammals. And that means that all of their life history traits can occur in the water. They never have to come to land to eat, sleep, breed, or anything like that. Whereas river otters can eat in the water and play in the water, but they have to come to land to sleep and breed. And they have different diets. So sea otters eat mostly benthic invertebrates such as clams, crabs, mussels, urchins, while river otters eat mostly fish. Some fun facts about sea otters are that they're very social and they tend to form these large groups called rafts. This is a raft of male sea otters in Washington state. They tend to sexually segregate. So the males will be at the edges of the sea otters range, large bachelor groups like this one, whereas the females and the territorial males will be in the center of the range. They reach sexual maturity by age 2. And once they reach that age, the reproductive rate is high. About 80 to 90% of the reproductive age females have one pup each year. And they live to be about 15 in the wild, longer in captivity. We've had a sea otter that came in from the wild that lived with the Seattle Aquarium for at least 22 years. So she was older than 22. And they are a true marine mammal, like I mentioned before. So these guys live in cold Pacific waters, but they don't have a blubber layer like other marine mammals to stay warm. So whereas seals, dolphins, whales, they all have a layer of fat around their bodies for insulation called blubber. So sea otters do not. They're the only marine mammal that does not. And if you look at this picture, they're fuzzy. So they have two ways to stay warm. One is they have the densest fur in the animal kingdom, 500,000 to 1,000,000 hairs per square inch, and that is about the size of your thumb and your forefinger together. Their fur is so thick and dense that the water can't actually reach their skin. And they also groom a layer of air next to their skin, so they're basically floating around in a little dry suit. But even though they're floating around in a little dry suit, which affords them effective insulation from the cold Pacific waters in which they live, they still are floating around in an ice bath, and so they still lose heat to the environment. To combat this, they have one of the highest metabolic rates in the animal kingdom. They eat 7 to 9,000 calories per day to maintain body condition. That's about 25 to 30% of their body weight every day. And they're going to have to eat more if they're growing, injured, or pregnant. So these guys eat a lot just to maintain their condition. A little bit about human sea otter connections. There's evidence that indigenous people have been interacting with sea otters for at least 10,000 years. So they've had the connection with the sea otters, and they would hunt them for their furs, their luxurious furs, because these were used in ceremonies and also as to trade with. But they also left areas where the sea otters were not harassed or hunted. So therefore, they used the ecosystem services that the sea otters provided. So they got benefits from harvesting the otters and benefits from leaving them in their environment. So for many, many, many thousands of years, people have been using sea otters for their fur and their ecosystem services. And then we get into the maritime fur trade. So this is a map of the sea otters. Oops, sorry. Range before the maritime fur trade. So they ranged from Japan throughout the Kuril Islands and Russia all the way through the Aleutian Island chain, throughout Alaska, and all along the west coast of North America down to Baja. And then the maritime fur trade started in 1741 and ended in 1911. And this trade basically, it was international trade. Europeans, Russians, Asians came to the North Pacific to hunt sea otters for their fur because it was so highly prized. And during this time, 99% of the sea otters in the world were eliminated for their fur. Luckily, we have these remnant populations that were left. So there are the orange ones scattered throughout. And if you see, there were remnants scattered throughout the Kurils, Russia, and the Aleutian Islands chain. And then this last one to the north was Prince William Sound. And then all of the west coast of North America, sea otters were hunted to extinction, except for this small population down here at California. So you had this population to the north, Prince William Sound, and then California left after the fur trade. Fast forward to today, this is what the sea otter range looks like today. So this area in brown is recovery from the fur trade. So those are recovery from the remnant populations. And you have this remnant population here in California that's recovered. And then there's this yellow population here. And these are the result of successful translocations that were done in the 1960s and 70s into areas that where the otters had been hunted to extinction. So pre-fur trade, we think that there were about, sorry, I'm trying to get rid of that. Oops. Sorry, you guys, what happened? Nope.
I think you might have closed the presentation view.
All right, let me start over. Sorry about that.
I
I
think
was trying to get rid of my laser pointer. There we go.
we go. Done.
Okay. Oh, I see what I did. Any rate, the pre-fur trade population estimates were about 300,000 sea otters throughout the whole range of the North Pacific. And then again, after the fur trade, about 1,000 to 2,000 sea otters were left. The total sea otters today in 2025 are about 120,000 sea otters. So they are close to 50% recovery. And what I want to note that in these areas where they have recovered, they are under-occupied. And then there still are areas here, like from central Washington down to central California, where they remain absent. So there still is a lot of sea otter recovery that needs to happen to fully recover the populations. So, what have we learned as sea otters recover? We have learned as they recovered from the fur trade in areas with and without sea otters over and over and over and over again. We have learned that they are a keystone species. And what is a keystone species? So, a keystone is that stone in the middle of an arch that holds the whole arch together. So it provides stability for the system. Again, as sea otters recovered from the fur trade, biologists could see areas with sea otters right adjacent to areas without sea otters as they recovered and as they expanded their range. So this is an experiment that biologists were able to observe hundreds, if not thousands of times. So where sea otters occur, there were healthy kelp forest communities. And those areas that still didn't have viable sea otter populations, there were urchin barrens. And urchin barrens are exactly what it sounds like. There's not that much on the benthos. It's dominated by urchins. There's little kelp and there's little few other species. So it really is just a monoculture. Again, with sea otters, you have healthy kelp forest ecosystems that provide food and shelter for many different animals, invertebrates, fish, seabirds, other marine mammals, and without, you have the urchin barrens, and then no food and no shelter for all those other species. Again, this is a look at a healthy kelp forest ecosystem that where sea otters occur. So how do they do this? Well, sea otters like to eat the things that eat the kelp. So this is a classic trophic cascade. So when sea otters move in, they eat primarily urchins and other things that eat the kelp, and so they release that kelp from pressure, and then it can recover. So this is what it looks like. So what happens when sea otters come into an area? There's a few things that happen, and this is a decrease in urchins over time as sea otters increase in density. The first thing that happens is there will be a decrease in, say, if there's an urchin fishery, commercial fisheries for things like urchins, crabs, and clams that sea otters like to eat. So initially, people will see it as a negative when the sea otters move in because their fishery that has been used to harvest without competitors, without other predators in the system will decrease. But over time, then the seagrasses, the kelps will start to increase, which will provide food and shelter for a whole host of other animals. And then what happens is the finfish start to increase because they have more food, more shelter. And so things like rockfish and salmon will start to increase. So the ecosystem will be more productive and more biodiverse. This is data from Vancouver Island, and they've shown this in areas where sea otters occur. You have areas with no otters, low kelp levels, and then over time they dramatically increase. So all of the canopy forming kelps increase as well as the understory kelps. And you'll see here there's an initial bump in some of these other kelps that then stabilize at a higher level than without the sea otters. And this is because the sea otters will promote habitat and food for those things that do like to eat the kelps, like the urchins, the abalones, and things like that. So the system is basically re-equilibrating with the sea otters, but it's much more biodiverse and more productive with the sea otters than without. Again, this is data from Vancouver Island. Over time, they saw a dramatic increase in finfish, rockfish, salmon, even an increase in crabs and snails that the sea otters like to eat, especially in areas where refuges from sea otter predation, so just a little bit deeper than sea otters can dive, which is 200 feet, and then an increase in the kelp. So we've seen this over and over and over again that sea otters are key to a more productive, more biodiverse ecosystem, not only in outer coast kelp dominated areas, but this has also been found in eelgrass beds. So the sea otters are now starting to move into bays and estuaries where there's eelgrass. And what they found is that sea otters will eat the crabs, and that will then release these snails and slugs from predation by the crabs. And then they're able to do their job by cleaning epiphytes or debris off of the eelgrass. And so the eelgrass is thicker and healthier and able to photosynthesize better in those estuaries with sea otters versus those without. So we did not know this until the sea otters got to a point of recovery where they would actually move into those inland basin estuaries with eelgrass. The same goes for sea otters in salt marsh communities. So we found that sea otters move into a salt marsh. They again eat those crabs, which were causing disturbances in the salt marsh grasses. And so the crabs would burrow into the salt marsh grass and make the salt marsh less stable and more prone to erosion in flooding events. But with the sea otters limited those crabs, and then the salt marsh was more stable and didn't erode as much with flooding systems. So sea otters really, as they continue to recover, we're seeing more and more of the ecosystem services that they are providing. And there's no we still haven't reached the end of the story because, as I mentioned earlier, sea otters are still endangered on the red list. So because of decreases, and they are listed as largely depleted in the IUCN green status. And I'll walk you through how we got there. So the red list is an assessment of a species' risk of extinction, and sea otters are endangered because of recent reductions, primarily in the sea otter populations in the western Aleutians, the Kurils, and Russia due to orca predation. So they're listed as endangered. And then recently we did do the green status assessment for sea otters to see how it matches up with the red list. And it really is a sister listing to the red list. So it should match up. But the green status is a measure of a species recovery and the impact of conservation. So you see here that sea otters are listed as largely depleted because they're still at about 50% recovery or 47% here. But their conservation legacy and dependence is high, and their conservation recovery potential is also high. So I'll walk you through that a little bit. How we determined the green status assessment. The first step was determine the range. And again, the current range, I showed this before, there are large areas where sea otters still haven't recovered at all. And then in many of these areas, they are under-occupied or they haven't occupied all previously occupied habitats like those inland bays and estuaries. So they're about 50% recovered from the fur trade. So first you have to determine the range. Second step is to determine the spatial units. And that's what we did here. We listed 20 spatial units from Japan all the way through Russia, the Aleutians, etc., to Washington and California. And the plan was to have each one of those spatial units have the same conservation status. The third step was to determine the species functionality in each one of those spatial units. So functional for sea otters would be the maintenance of kelp forests, eelgrass, salt marshes through the top-down control, eating up herbivores or those urchins. Viable is populations that are relatively stable with breeding populations and some areas of ecosystem functioning. Present is present but not viable yet, and absent is they're absent. They're into previously occupied habitat has not been occupied yet. So then for each of the spatial units, we give a recovery score at the current state. And so here I can't list all 20 spatial units. It's too much to put on one slide, but you can see this is the current state. For Western Japan, they're still absent. They're present in Northern Japan, present in the Kurils, etc. And then we have a map of the spatial units with their relative recoveries. So the red is where sea otters are absent. The light green is where sea otters are present. The darker green is where sea otters are viable, and in some of those areas they are functional. And then the red here is absent again, this large swath, and then here they're viable and in some areas functional. And then for the green status, they asked us to think about potential range expansion with climate change. And so that's these gray shaded areas. And so we hypothesize that as the oceans warm, there may be more ice-free areas year round where sea otters could move north. And since they have to feed every day just to maintain body condition, they can only live in areas that are ice-free. The next was to determine the most likely future scenarios with and without conservation action. So we already talked about the former state is basically the fur trade, and they would be mostly absent with a few present. The current state is what is happening right now, that map. And then the current state we had to determine without conservation. So what would happen to sea otters currently if we lifted those protections? And then the future in 10 years with conservation, the future in 10 years without conservation, and then the future in 100 years with conservation. Sorry for the typos there. So the results are that, again, sea otters are largely depleted. They're 47% recovered, but they have a super high conservation legacy. And in that they wouldn't even be 47% recovered. In fact, they would be extinct if there weren't the protections that were put in from 1911 to stop the fur trade. Thus, and moving forward, their conservation dependence is very high as well, because if we lifted all the protections now, which are land and water protections or habitat protections, future reintroductions, and then limiting take, they would crash again. So if, say, the fur trade happened again, the sea otter populations would crash. This low conservation gain, that's what would happen to sea otters in 10 years if nothing changed. And the reason why that's low is because sea otter populations don't expand naturally quickly. So in the next 10 years, they maybe will bump up a little bit, but not a lot. And their range expansion into that unoccupied area is unlikely to happen. So in 10 years, if we did do more reintroductions, it still wouldn't change that much because those reintroductions take time for the sea otter populations to get to any number and to be viable and functional. But the recovery potential is very high in the next 100 years. Let's say there's multiple reintroductions, we protect their habitat, and we limit take. Sea otters will probably reach 100% recovery. The threats to their recovery is pollution, diseases, unregulated take, and then the unknown effects of climate change. And here is a graphical representation of the green status. Again, this is the current. If there was no protections, they would go to extinction. But with the protections, we're at that about 50% recovery. The future in 10 years, if we lifted all protections and opened up the fur trade again, they would crash again. But then with more conservation actions in the next 10 years, unless we did massive reintroductions, which would be difficult, the conservation gain is relatively low. But over 100 years, if we do all the things that we should do to recover sea otters, we definitely think that they could fully recover. So, what are the conservation measures that can help sea otters achieve full recovery? Keep protections in place, no take or harassment, and then those future reintroductions. 30% of the sea otters that are alive today are the result of successful reintroduction. So this really works for sea otters, and we should do more of it. They're in this area where the sea otters were moved in the 60s and 70s. Now there's about 40,000 sea otters that live in that area. And if this didn't happen, their range would still stop around the Gulf of Alaska, and then this whole area would be absent of sea otters until you got to Central California. So there really have been a huge success for sea otter recovery. And I wanted to dive a little bit into one of those success stories, or the Washington's states reintroduced sea otters, as I've been studying these guys for about 25 years. And it's really been a great success story because a little bit of history. Washington's last native sea otter was hunted for its fur in 1910 near Willapa Bay. Almost 60 years later, sea otters were reintroduced from Amchitka Island, Alaska, to Washington, 29 near Point Granville and 30 near La Push. I'll show you where that is on a map in a moment. And even though about 60 sea otters were moved, many of them died when they were released because of husbandry issues and other things. And it's estimated only 10 animals survived to found the population that we have today. So they were moved from Amchitka Island way over here in the Western Aleutians to Washington State. That's a long ways to go. And how do we know how they're doing? Well, there's an annual population survey in which the Seattle Aquarium participates in. It's a multi-day annual count from the ground and the air. It started in 1989 when there were less than 100 animals, and it's organized by the feds and the state who fly the plane. And then here we are on the ground with our spotting scopes and binoculars. The plane will get pictures from the air of the larger rafts that they see, where the ground counters are counting all those lone individuals or the scattered individuals, and they're also getting a number of pups to adult animals. So again, this is where most of the sea otters occur, on the outer Washington coast. The plane leaves Olympia here, flies out to the coast, goes all along the outer coast range, and then also flies along the western Strait of Juan de Fuca to see if the animals are moving in there. Does this twice a day if the weather's good, and then multiple days to get the highest possible count. And then here we are on the ground counting to assist in that effort. And this is what it looks like. They've been doing it since 1989 when there were just a couple hundred sea otters. Over time, it's grown 10% per year. Yay. And the highest number here was in 2022. About 3,000 sea otters exist in Washington state today, 50 years after they were reintroduced. So it does take a while to get numbers into the thousands. You can see here they didn't even reach 1,000 until the reintroduction was almost 40 years old. So it takes a while for the sea otter populations to grow. There's a lot of interannual variability in the last few years, and we think that's because of growing pains. So as the sea otter populations have grown, they were reintroduced here off of central Washington. They initially moved to the north, but in the mid 2000s, they started expanding their range to the south. And then more recently, they've started to expand their range offshore. And so if the plane doesn't do that offshore flight, which they don't always do, we get a low count. But when they do the offshore flight, we get the higher counts. And these guys that are offshore are too far offshore for the ground counters to see with their spotting scope. So that is a little bit of a problem. So now the goal is anytime we do a survey is to make sure that we do the offshore counts. And what's fun is recently there's been a group of young otters that have moved into this area of the Western Strait of Juan de Fuca near Clallam Bay, and they're staying there. And actually, it's been a few years they've been there, and now we're starting to see females with those younger males. So that's exciting. That might become a viable breeding population there. And this is a little video of one of the Washington sea otters eating a crab next to her sleeping pup. And this is another data set that we gather. We gather data on diet, which also helps us determine whether or not the sea otters are reaching equilibrium in certain areas of their range. She's eating a snail now. Because the diet does change as the sea otters reach equilibrium, their diet starts to diversify. They're eating less of the larger preferred prey. And at that point, then it's going to be time for range expansion. And so we go out every month and we document their diet diversity. And this is a female with a larger pup eating a clam. And you can see there the larger pup is stealing some of the clam. But it's really fun. And lastly, some new research that we are starting right now is research into how sea otters stabilize kelp ecosystems and mediate the negative effects of climate change. And this was initially brought to the world's attention by Rasher et al. In 2020, published this paper in Science called Keystone Predators Govern the Pathway and Pace of Climate Impacts in Subarctic Marine Ecosystem. And that's just a fancy way of saying where there are sea otters in warming waters and more acidic waters, they can mitigate the negative effects of more voracious urchins. So this whole paper was about with climate change, urchins are going to be more destructive, but with areas with sea otters, then this is going to be mitigated and the benthos won't change with warming waters and more acidic waters, although they didn't have data from actual areas with sea otters. So I actually have benthic data in Washington of areas with and without sea otters and climate change effects. So in 2013, 14, 15 in Washington, there was a warm water event called the blob, so a marine heat wave, and there was also sea star wasting happened at the same time. And what I found on my underwater surveys is that kelp and understory algae dramatically decreased at many of the dive sites that we're going to. And also the urchins just exploded right here at 2015 in sites 1 through 4, but not at site 5. So what's happening at site 5? This is site 1. And what I want to show you here is that there was sponges and sea stars and understory algae, and then the marine heat wave happened in 2014-15 and sea stars wasted. Fast forward, the urchins have scoured it clean. There's no more sponges, there's no more sea stars, there's no more understory algae. Yet, this site 5, here's before the marine heat wave and sea star wasting. We see algae, there's sponges, fast forward. It doesn't look any different. I know the quality of these two photos is different, but the benthos in site 5 did not change. The oceans warmed, sea stars wasted, and it did not change. And we think this is because the sea otters were present there and they were stabilizing this system by not letting the urchins get out of control. So we're going to vastly expand on this work. We're trying to get some money to do. I just have 5 sites. We're trying to get money to document many, many, many sites along the outer Washington coast, dozens of sites in areas with sea otters and areas without sea otters and at varying densities to see how they can mediate these marine heat waves and climate change events. So it's really exciting to think that sea otter things can go totally wrong and a marine heat wave could happen, a disease outbreak can happen, but if there's sea otters, the benthos won't change. So here's a success story here. Oops. This I thought was kelp in front of this rock in central Washington. That is actually sea otters. And I zoomed in with my spotting scope, and you can see all of those otters in the scope. This is a raft of 700 sea otters off the coast of Washington. So the sea otters are doing very well in Washington, and so is the ecosystem. And it also shows you each one of these animals has to eat 25 to 30% of its body weight every day just to stay alive, and they're doing fine in central in Washington, and that just shows you how productive the marine ecosystem is in Washington state. If you want to learn more, I co-edited this book on sea otter conservation. It's all about the basic biology ecology of sea otters in 2015. And more recently this year, 2025, we released a new book, a follow-up on that one called Sea Otter Conservation 2. And it's all about the sea otter's role in nearshore ecosystem restoration and what we've learned from the fur trade. And with that, I'll take any questions. Should I stop sharing?
That's okay. Thank you, Sean. It's a nice picture to have on the screen for now. Thanks for this wonderful presentation. Always very cool to hear what you do and what you did on the sea otter front. So Anna has a question that I will start with since
Okay.
she's the co-chair.
Yes.
Anna would like to know if there's already any evidence on range expansion at the northern boundary of the range following global warming, and if any monitoring is ongoing in these potential areas of expansion.
Okay, that's a great question. And I think I have not heard that there's any monitoring going on in the northern Bering Sea because they are having such a hard time funding just monitoring the populations, in the Aleutian and the Alaska Peninsula. And it's such a vast area to expand that into areas for potentially sea otters could be moving into. They don't have the funding. I think that it's going to be anecdotal, fisher reports, things like that. And if they keep on getting more reports, which I haven't heard from, then they might try and do some flights up there to see if they're actually expanding to the north.
Okay, thank you. So we have a few questions via private chat. I will continue with do sea otters and river otters interact usually?
Um, that is a great question. We have sea otters and river otters at the Seattle Aquarium, but they're in 2 different habitats, so they're not interacting. Um, I have documented sea otters foraging in the nearshore off the Washington coast and river otters in the same area. So I think they knew they were both there, but I didn't see them interacting. I know sea otters will haul out. Sometimes they don't have to come out of the water, but they do sometimes haul out, and they will haul out right next to harbor seals and sea lions, and everybody just gets along. There's no fighting or anything like that. So I think they're aware of each other, but I haven't seen any positive or negative interaction, so any play or anything like that. That's a great question.
I'm also thinking about disease transmission. That's really interesting. Also, if
Yeah.
you say that they're hauling out together with harbor seals, well,
Well, and the sea otters in Washington State, they've been tested positive for canine distemper. They
Hmm.
also have diseases that they get from wild cats, Toxoplasma gondii, and things like that. So they definitely are exposed to, um, well, they're living in the nearshore. They're coming close to land, and they're eating a lot of filter feeders that will concentrate eggs, parasite eggs, and then also viruses and bacteria and algae.
So, Sean, if you ever think that there's a research opportunity, I think there's plenty of young, enthusiastic people who would like to come to
Yeah.
Seattle and do some research on that. So,
Okay.
next question. Are there any relevant ex situ projects for sea otters nowadays? And do you think that the ex situ component is relevant for this species?
Oh, absolutely. So that is research in zoos and aquariums, correct? Yeah.
Yes.
There is a lot of, we've learned a lot about sea otters in zoos and aquariums. I did my dissertation on sea otter reproduction, tracking reproductive physiology of sea otters in zoos and aquariums. So I learned a lot, definitely. There's always husbandry research going on, there's nutritional research, there's behavioral ecology research going on. Yeah, there's um, a lot of research going on with sea otters in zoos and aquariums, and I think it definitely is important and impactful, especially the behavioral ecology, because as future reintroductions are planned, like into Northern California and Oregon, I think it's really important that we understand more about the sea otter social system and their behavior, because we think that the reason why some of the translocations in the past weren't as successful as they could have been, like the one to Oregon, which wasn't successful at all, and then the one to San Nicolas Island off of Southern California, where most of the sea otters swam back to Monterey, which is hundreds of miles away, is that we don't understand their social system well enough. And we think that perhaps that the especially the female sea otters spend their whole lives with relatives and they have a very tight social system. So if we learn more about their social system and maybe move related groups in the reintroductions, then they may stay put better. So there was just a lot about their behavior that we don't understand and their social system. There's a lot about their physiology we're still learning. So we're learning that they react differently to contraceptives. They're just a really unique otter and a really unique marine mammal that has so many adaptations that no other animal has. So we're constantly learning more, and that really the best way to learn more about their behavior, physiology, and social system is in a controlled setting.
Thank you for that answer and the shout out to the zoological institutions following the one plan approach. I also think this is, yeah, a really good thing to follow. The next question is by Chloe. As the population has increased, has there been any issues with conflict with humans or negative attitudes towards sea otters?
Yes, fisheries conflicts are definitely a problem or a reality in areas where sea otters reoccupy. And we think that it's mostly because sea otters were removed from the ecosystem for so long and so haven't been in many areas, sometimes for over 150 years. And so the local people do not remember what it was like to live with sea otters and live with a keystone species and live with a predator. And so they're um, their baseline of harvest of, say, things that sea otters like to eat is abnormally inflated because they're not harvesting in the presence of another predator that likes to eat what they eat. And so there's generally this negative thought like, oh, we're not going to be able to fish for crab anymore. We're not going to be able to fish for urchins. We're not going to be able to fish for clams, etc. And this does happen when sea otters first move into an area. They do deplete their preferred prey. So it's not like people are, it's not a real thing. It does happen. But over time, as an ecosystem equilibrates, then those crabs and clams and urchins will come back. And then there's going to be more finfish. So it's going to be more diverse, more productive ecosystems with sea otters than without. And so this is what we try and educate the fishers that yes, initially your harvest of some of these species will decrease, but actually you can still fish for them, but if you go beyond the sea otter's diving depth, you're actually going to find more because that kelp in the nearshore is going to provide nutrients and food for the animals that live deeper, and they actually will thrive. So I know in Washington State, the crab fishery has not been hurt by the presence of the sea otters. So it's just something that people have to be educated about, and some people really are not receptive, and you just have to accept that.
Yeah, probably. Still, I think it's really impressive the research that you did and that you're still doing. You presented some of the graphs, and I think that people can really understand that on the long term they will also benefit from sea otter presence. Thank you.
Well, and the fish are going to increase in size
Yeah,
and number. So yeah. So, it's a trade-off, but these complete ecosystems with keystone species are really what um, the world needs in the face of all these disturbances. And I heard that at the World Conservation Congress is that there's a real need to conserve complete whole na nature that is complete and whole because around the world, scientists have seen that those systems are more resilient to climate change.
yeah, that's a very important point. There's tons of questions coming in. I'll try to filter a bit.
Okay.
So there's one. Okay, Margarita says 7 more minutes. We have to hurry up a bit. There's a question by Caleb, building on top of Chloe's question. Has there been any change in attitude between communities who experience more otter interactions than those who don't, as this may affect perceptions overall? Maybe you partly already answered that.
So what's interesting, and we found this, in British Columbia and California. So there's an increase in ecotourism around wanting to see otters. So that brings money to the community because people want to go on otter tours or kayak with otters and things like that. So they get a bump in not only the ecosystem services that the sea otters provide, but they also get money via tourism and that people like to watch marine mammals, particularly. Um, and it's just it's really like the indigenous peoples too. It's learning, is reconnecting humans with sea otters in those coastal communities. So it's the stories, it's the interaction, it's, bringing different people to those communities to appreciate them, and then also changing the way that people say fish, for example. So it's there's just so many things that we've lost with the fur trade, those human sea otter connections that we're rediscovering as sea otters recover. So I don't know if I'm answering that correctly because there's so many different things that happen when sea otters recover an area. So many people get very excited, and then other people get very upset. And really sea otters are not, there's not a neutral ground, I don't think, with sea otters. So it's like love them or hate them. And it's really about reaching out and doing due diligence to stakeholders and the community, like the Alaka Alliance is doing in Oregon, who's leading the effort to reintroduce sea otters into Oregon so they can have those ecosystem services that the sea otters provide. They've been doing outreach about sea otters, their positives, and the plan for reintroduction for a long time. And the communities are much more receptive of the idea because of that.
Yeah. And the cool thing is that the recovery is still ongoing, right? So we can still observe how the attitudes might change and
We're
adapt.
only 50% recovered, and we've learned so much so far.
Mhm.
Yeah. And then the sea otter dynamics will change as it reaches full recovery. So I said earlier, the male bachelor groups are on the edges of the range, but what happens when there's no edge anymore? What's going to happen then? Maybe those males will be scattered right adjacent to the territorial males with the female groups. Who knows? So what we know about sea otters today is really based on that they're still recovering. and our perception of sea otters will change as they reach full recovery, and who knows what we'll find.
The more I listen, the more I want to study sea otters now. So we are allowed three more questions, Sean. The next question
Okay.
is by Romney. Super interesting to hear about the role sea otters play in eelgrass and salt marsh communities. Are there published papers on this, or are these observations
Yes.
so new that results are still forthcoming?
There's several published papers about them by Hughes et al., mostly Hughes et al., and then also Foster et al. So if you go on Google Scholar and you just put in Hughes et al., eelgrass and salt marsh, many papers published in the last 5 years, 3 or 4, and then Foster published a paper in the last few years about where sea otters dig in eelgrass communities to dig for clams. The eelgrass is actually more genetically diverse. So it does better because it stimulates the eelgrass to sexually reproduce. So super fascinating. Again, we've lost these connections with the sea otters and the nearshore communities in which they used to live. And as they reoccupy, we're finding out so many new and interesting connections.
I'm
Okay.
just going to step in here really quickly to say that in our new website, each species is going to have an updated bibliography.
Biblia.
Going to try and update it every year. So you'll be able to go to the page dedicated to the species and open a PDF file that has all the names of the articles.
And also, we can offer you, Sean, to send us some links of the most relevant literature, papers, whatever, and we can put that to like upload that together with the video on YouTube. So next question would be by Matthias and also partly by Anna. They basically asked similar question. Thanks for the great presentation. You mentioned that you worked on the genetics. Was there any inbred factor with the starting population of just 10 animals?
Yeah, so that's interesting. So my dissertation was looking at genetic diversity in sea otters currently, which is relatively low. And then I looked at pre-fur trade sea otters, which is normal genetic diversity. So the fur trade, when they were 99% of the sea otters in the world were hunted for their fur, they obviously lost genetic diversity. What's interesting with the Washington sea otters, they went through another bottleneck with that 10. So they had, and they were from Amchitka, so they had the same genetic diversity as the Aleutian Island change. It didn't seem like they lost that much from that contraction. And what's interesting is now, since they've grown and the reintroduced population in Vancouver Island, British Columbia has grown, the two have merged, and the British Columbia otters are mostly from Prince William Sound, and the Washington otters are mostly from Amchitka, which are different genetic sources. So British Columbia and Washington now have some of the highest measured genetic diversity of any sea otter population. So that is another benefit of reintroductions, especially if you get sources from different areas that have different genetic signatures. So they're approaching about 70% recovery of their diversity from the loss associated with the fur trade.
That's pretty cool. That's good news.
Yes.
So last question by Maya. Is the viable functional southern limit of sea otter still Morro Bay?
Oh, southern sea otters, that is great question. They occur south now near Point Conception, but they've stopped moving, or the range expansion has stopped moving further south. We think because, well, we know because of great white bites. So the great whites are in that area, mostly juveniles, and they'll see a resting sea otter and they test it because they think it might be a seal and it's not. But after they've tested it, that otter's dead. So the southern limit of the main population in California is now about Santa Barbara area. Um, Functional, you asked functional, probably Morro Bay, but I would have to look into the data just south of Morro Bay. I know there are functional densities in Morro Bay for sure. And then there is that translocated group off of Southern California, San Nicolas Island, which they moved in the 1980s, that now has reached levels of functionality because it's finally, after 40 years post-translocation, reached 100 animals. So That's a great question, and I'd have to look into the density data as well as the benthic data, which I don't have the top of my fingers right now.
Okay. Thank you, Shawn, for answering the questions. There were more, and I think we put your email in the chat so people could ask you directly if there's more questions.
Okay,
So we would
great.
like to take a group photo. So please, everyone, turn on the cameras.
And
I'll
Shawn,
It's
stop
an
my share.
order.
yes, there we go. Ah, perfect. Thank you. Let's see if everybody can come online, if they want, of course. Not forcing anyone to do what they do not want to do, of course. There we go. Yay. So many people. Hello,
A bunch of
everyone.
people dropped off. Didn't want the picture.
Well, I mean, I am also like that. If somebody says, "Does anyone want to volunteer?" It's like, no, thank you, bye. I don't exist anymore. Okay, took some more pictures. I think we're good. Yay.
Perfect.
Okay, perfect.
Well,
Thank you, everyone.
thank you for
Thanks,
joining.
Tom.
Thanks, Shawn, for presenting. That was wonderful, and hopefully
Thank
see
you.
many of you next time.
Yes. See you
Bye,
soon.
everybody.
Bye bye.
Margarita, do you want me to stay on for a moment?
Sure.
Yes,
Yes.
please.
Yes.
Debrief.